Thank you very much, Marek, for that very fine introduction. I was the only person, I think, in the room. No, there's a second person with a headphone on their ears, which makes me already kind of the striped animal in the room. I indeed do not understand Polish nor speak it, so you actually should be glad that I will be speaking in English, because in Polish it would be a wasted morning for you. It's great to be here in Warsaw. I've met Marek last night. We had a conversation already, and it's always great to come from Berlin and also in earlier times from Brussels to this place, because it is a place that has energy and aspiration. It is not a saturated place like Brussels and Berlin often can appear to be. And so the energy here is often a great corrective for somebody who comes from the big bubble towns to this town and to get the messages here. I would like to thank Marek and the European Commission Office for doing this. This has been in the making for quite some time, and the great element that made all of this possible is Marek's patience with me, who really, stuck to the plan and endured quite a bit of haggling and uncertainty about the date. So, Marek, your patience, as always, is the key ingredient to making this a success. As also your tenure in Brussels is proof of. But also to Nowa Konfederacja, who make this possible, who's co-hosting this. And I'm really curious to start a relationship with your organization. This is the first time that I'm working with you, and I'm quite curious to learn how you see the world and how this can infuse my own work with new thoughts. The topic that was chosen for today is the question of Europe in between the new rivalry between the U.S. and China. Basically, the big question of the new order that is emerging and how we play a role in it. I mean, it could not really be a much larger question, I guess. It's a huge topic. Some of the answers that you might be looking for, you will find in the report that was published yesterday, the big ESPAS report that was published by the European institutions yesterday, which I printed out. And it is actually quite an interesting and very direct language that you will find, not the usual Brussels document language goulash, but something that's really quite to the point and quite straight. Have a look at the ESPAS report. It looks at 2030, so basically 10 years into the future. And it makes for sobering reading, I have to say. You cannot blame the EU institutions for not seeing the writing on the wall. Whether that means action is another question, but in terms of the analysis and in terms of the clarity of the view on the problems that we're facing, there cannot really be much of a doubt. So, starting with this question of how do we fit into this new order as Europeans between the two big rivals, maybe starts with the question of what kind of situation do we actually want? What kind of life do we want in that new order? And the answers that are always true are the simple ones. We want to be prosperous, we want to be free, and we want to be at peace. That's always true. Those are the three pillars that always kind of apply. But of course, in practice, that means a couple of much more sophisticated things that means. First of all, it means that we want to be free from political and nuclear blackmail. Secondly, we want to choose whom to share our sovereignty with. I think it's a very important point. Sovereignty is kind of the buzzword of the day, and lots of sovereigntists are running around, claiming that sovereignty is kind of the highest good, and it is. But the real question is not, whether you can completely keep it, because you can't. That's not the world any longer that we live in. The question is, whom do you share it with, and do you do it voluntarily? We want a world in which we can decide ourselves whom to share our sovereignty with. That's the situation we would like to maintain in that new world order that's emerging. We want to be capable of serving our people and provide them with the basic needs. And we want to sleep at ease at night, which means that there needs to be trust in the system. The kind of secret ingredient to the whole European enterprise is trust, more than money or anything else. But for that, you need people who infuse trust and produce trust and also deserve trust. You need some guardians of trust, in a way. And you need to have some hope that the future is going to be good. We tend to say in big speeches that, the best days are ahead of us. Nobody knows that. But we want to hope that at least the future will be good. Maybe not, stellar, maybe not, something that necessarily needs to be 150% better than the present, but it needs to be good. And once that hope disappears, you get radical politics, as we can also observe in Europe these days. So how can we have that life that, I've just sketched out very roughly, I think it depends, in my opinion, on 4 questions primarily. Of course, it depends on tons of things, but I will pick the 4 that I find the most important ones, and then perhaps later on we can go into a Q&A in which we look at some other factors as well. And I will give you those 4 questions right away before going into them. The first question that will decide as to whether we can have that life is, does America want to keep its real estate in Europe? Is it still interested in its sphere of influence, which is a word that not everybody likes? Does it want to keep its real estate in Europe? The second question is, can we add an element of power politics to the EU? The third question is, how can we stay economically viable and strong? And the fourth one is, what does China actually want from us? Those are the 4 questions that I would raise today. And then again, as I said, you can perhaps focus on millions of other questions as well, but this is my offering here for today. So the first question, does America want to keep its real estate? We in Europe live off borrowed stability. We live under an American security guarantee, a nuclear umbrella that allows us to do this, to have this life. And the big question is, can it stay that way? That is a crucial strategic question. And it's important to remind ourselves that America's function was twofold in this Pax Americana that we've always been talking about for so much. It has an external function, that's the protective function, the security guarantee administered through NATO with a nuclear element, a very important one. But it also had an internal effect on Europe, the American presence in Europe, because it made obsolete all of the old power rivalries between the Europeans and among the Europeans. It put those on mute. By being the most dominant political and military power in Europe, America put the old rivalries between the Germans and the French and the Swedes and the Austrians and whoever played a role in 2,000 years of history, put them basically on the sideline. And that was a trust infusion. Because of this, Europeans could trust each other because the old rivalry question wasn't important any longer. And one of the most important prerequisites that we forget when we talk about European integration is that American trust infusion that made that possible. So what we've seen, and this is the dramatic part of this argument, is over the last 25 years roughly, we've seen a reduction of the American footprint in Europe, pretty systematically, until recently when we saw a reinvestment. But we've seen a drawing down of both the military and the political footprint. It's also more difficult in Washington to make a case for Europe these days than it used to be. So our currency is weaker. So the question is, when there's less of an interest, and I think the reinvestment that we've seen in recent years is not anywhere near to make up for what we lost in the previous decades. It's important, but it doesn't make up for it. The question is, if that lack of, or that reduction of American interest comes in, how does the European market react to this? In my opinion, some of the rivalries, some of what we call renationalization in Europe also has to do with the fact that that American trust infusion has been withdrawn from the market and that the American disciplining power in Europe is weaker. So we have seen this reinvestment, but we also have serious doubts about the reliability of the American role in Europe, partly because of this president, partly because of long-term trends that will lead the United States away from Europe. 2 very quick examples to illustrate that mechanism. One is the INF that Marek already mentioned just now. The INF treaty, in the INF decision to basically phase it out, if you want to put it into kind words, that was a decision taken both by Russia and the United States for different reasons, but basically unanimously because they both feared China. That's the big story that very few people tell. It is not primarily a decision that had to do with Europe. And this tells you how our strategic value in this entire big power game is already one of secondary or tertiary importance. Both Russia and the United States decided that they were part of a treaty that put them at a disadvantage vis-à-vis China in a new world where China is a power player that it wasn't when the treaty was created. And we are at the receiving end of this decision. It is made because of a reason that's outside of Europe, to basically kill INF, but it is a decision that will have a tremendous impact on Europe because of the asymmetry of interest. While Russia is interested in China and America is interested in China, Russia is also tremendously interested in Europe. And we're not so sure whether that interest exists on the American side as well. And Russia will most certainly use that decision to change the power balance in Europe, and that's going to be a problem. But the key thing in the INF decision is that a big strategic decision that affects our power balance in Europe was made not because of us. but because of some bigger player outside of the European theater. That tells you that we are not the number one strategic concern any longer. We are of secondary or tertiary importance, and that's a big strategic change. During the Cold War, for America, in order to prevail in that contest with the Soviet Union, it was key to own Europe. In the contest with China, it is perhaps no longer key to own Europe. How do we deal with this? And then there's a second decision which also puts this American ownership of property in Europe into question, and that is the way that the United States decided to alienate the Europeans first before it took the trade battle with China. Lots of people that I talk to ask themselves, why did Trump, if he really is concerned about China as a trade problem and as a currency problem, why did he first alienate the Europeans, who are his best allies in this battle with China, who have 100% the same concerns about Chinese trade and currency policies? And if you can afford or think you can afford to alienate your best partner first before tackling the big one, then maybe something with your strategic priorities is so different from the past that we Europeans really should be alerted. I'm saying this as an ardent transatlanticist who believes that the Europeans need America and need America's presence on the ground and is working for a transatlantic organization, the GMF. But there is reason to also be concerned, not just about our part of the equation. Our part of the equation is in many ways lackluster. And I'm talking coming from a country which is not particularly forthcoming with its contribution to transatlanticism these days. But at the same time, we need to be worried whether America wants to keep its real estate in Europe, first question. So we need, as Europeans, to keep America in the old rationale. And in order to keep them in, I think we have to do two things. We have to be serious about our own security, because otherwise, why should America be if we're not serious about it ourselves? And secondly, we must be, in some way or another, useful to the Americans in that new order. This is interesting that you find that sentence also in that ESPAS report that was published in Brussels yesterday. As I said, it's quite a sober assessment. They're not really fooling themselves there. The second question, can we add a power politics element to the EU? The EU gets slammed a lot for not really being a very strong foreign policy player, and for good reason. You know, the one voice question, can Europe speak with one voice? Can it finally become a player that, you know, is a foreign policy player the same way that it is a trade player? Can its money that it spends around the world translate into political influence as well? And those are justified criticisms, but they're also slightly unfair, because the European Union, when it was created, was not meant to be a power-projecting foreign policy player. That was not its role. The EU was made for serving mostly a European internal purpose. It was meant to make people rich, reconstruct the continent, and it was meant to work as a compromise machine to deal with the problems that Europeans otherwise fight out in the battlefields. And it works brilliantly that way. The core purpose for which it was built works brilliantly. The most blame is heaped on the EU for things that it was never built for, but which now need to be delivered. Foreign policy, refugee and asylum policy, questions of the currency, perhaps, if you want to go that way, questions of social Europe, which I think is a big seller in some countries and not such a big seller in others. But Europe gets blamed mostly for those things that it wasn't constructed for. And now we have to make it different. We have to build something that's more useful, not to make ourselves, in my opinion, strategically autonomous from the United States, but to demonstrate to the United States that we are serious about ourselves, and therefore you, America, need to be serious about us as well. That's the key rationale. So we have to become more of a power player. But that is difficult. We are not a united continent. We are a divided continent. We have lots of politics in a very small space. The continent of Europe is inherently unstable. It is not inherently stable. It is a continent that needs a reinvestment into its stability all the time. Look at the history books. And so how can we do this if that American trust infusion is at least smaller than it used to be? In my opinion, the foreign policy part, which includes the defense part, if you think it to the end, is probably not going to happen in that old integrationist logic of the EU. That works better for markets, and that works for, you know, other policies, other related policies. But I think the integration logic does not really apply to foreign policy. I've come a long way, you know, from somebody who was very hopeful about EU foreign policy, who started a blog in Brussels, Strategic Europe, arguing that it had to be. But I think now that the hopes were probably too high. I would look at something a bit more sober. But the key thing is that the power that the EU is supposed to project needs to come from the member states. The member states need to be the source of it, and that means that only 4 or 5 or 6 can actually deliver, because the rest is too small, and the rest doesn't really make too much of a difference. Not that they're irrelevant, they're highly relevant, because we want to keep Europe together, but in terms of power projection, their role will be smaller. So with the UK most likely being out, we have a very, very small set of countries that can actually make a difference. And they will not be able to make a difference alone. So they need to find some sort of compromise in which they can give the EU a power projection capability. It is, of course, primarily my own country in France, Germany and France. And it is then Italy, Spain, and Poland. And it is then perhaps the Netherlands and Sweden. It's very unpopular in these kinds of conferences to name countries and name names, but I will name them so we can have a debate. It's interesting. I think these are the countries ultimately that matter the most. The rest also matters, but these are the ones that need to come together. Whether that's a European Security Council or some other mechanisms in which you bring them in, it will not be a fully integrated foreign policy as some federalists dream, but it will have to be some sort of agreement of these countries that some muscle needs to be built and that needs to be put at the service of the EU. If that's not going to happen within the next 10 years until 2030, we will be toast. We will not be able to take care of our own neighborhood. We will not be able to demonstrate to the Americans that we can take over some of the questions that they would like us to take over. And we will not be able to demonstrate to our citizens that we are serious about the stuff that they're concerned about. I have no idea how that can be forged. The only thing that I do know is that it needs to come from the member states. It needs to come from the capitals. The impulse needs to come from Berlin and Warsaw and Paris and Madrid and Rome and some other places. It will not be coming from anywhere else. The European institutions are not strong enough in their own right to create that energy. It needs to come from the member states, and that means it also needs to come from here. And it certainly needs to come from my country, but that's going to be a discussion that I hope we can have in the Q&A. Germany's role in this, of course, is crucial, but also very difficult. How can we stay economically strong? Economic power in many ways is the basis of all other power, and it certainly is potentially the basis of our power. And it is a source of resilience against other people's money, which we can see pouring in today. There's the EU China summit, which is to a certain extent about Chinese money pouring into this market, into the European market, buying influence. So how can we stay economically strong that the temptation of other money coming into this market is smaller? Growth, innovation, and immigration will be the key questions. We have to reform the euro. Again, my country will be at the forefront of this. Your country is not in the euro and will perhaps not be in the euro anytime soon. But for the sake of all of the EU, the euro needs to be reformed. There needs to be some sort of political framework around the currency. Otherwise, the imbalance between deep economic integration and shallow political integration is going to tear the whole thing apart. Some sort of compromise will need to be found, and it will probably be quite expensive, but a lot less expensive than making the whole thing fail. That realization hasn't reached Berlin yet, but it will have to reach Berlin in order to get the euro on a stable footing. We need to embrace the IT revolution and new technologies. That includes new energy technologies. Big growth will be in IT and in green technologies. I'm not a green person, from where I come from, basically, but when you look at the numbers, when you look at where the growth potential is, when you look at where the sheer necessity is, that's the sector that will skyrocket. And it's already doing so, only that we don't realize this. The Germans are obsessed with their own cars, but other industries are coming quite fast to catch up. And we have to handle migration and immigration. And we need to change the migration debate from a debate that is mostly concerned about how to send people back most effectively. That is part of the equation as well, that can't be forgotten. But the key thing will be, whom do we want, whom can we get, and how can we integrate them? An aging continent is aging very fast, that has a demographic problem that we know about. We read about this all the time, but the massive impact that this will have and already has on our politics, risk aversity, overspending on social services instead of some of the investment sides and security and so on and so forth, those consequences are already in the debate. We have to deal with migration one way or another, and a strict rejection policy is not going to work. Yes, migration has a cultural element. But if we don't handle it smartly, the cultural element will be the smaller concern. The bigger concern will be that our societies will ossify. So one of the big answers to the economic question that I'm asking will be migration one way or another. And then there's this big challenge, and it's going to play out today pretty dramatically in Brussels as the EU-China summit unfolds. We're going to see basically a clash between a market and competition-driven entity like the EU clashing with an entity like China that has strong market power and like some liberalism in this, some openness, but not all of it. China is in a dilemma because it likes the liberal system that it has thrived in, but at the same time the liberal system is a huge threat to it because it undermines the power monopoly of the Communist Party of China. So it needs to find a kind of wiggle through in a way. And we are in a bind as well because in principle we like open markets, the single market and open trade relations, but at the same time we have national instincts and protectionist instincts. So these two things will clash today, and the big challenge is whether we can retain some openness and liberalism in this clash that's going to outplay today. I saw some quite pessimistic reports coming out of the press this morning saying that the EU will most likely walk away with empty hands from this summit because the Chinese are not willing to guarantee market access and uncoupling and investment, so on, so that you don't need a Chinese counterpart when you invest. All of these big questions that are on the table. But you can see how that new order and where the fault lines of the new order lie in that summit that's playing out in Brussels today. It sounds like a technical, boring kind of thing, trade with China. It is indeed the very core of the question that we're discussing here this morning in many ways. Is it going to be national champions or European champions against open market and competition? And if not one or the other, what kind of middle way? An indication will also be coming from the coming U.S. China deal, which is still kind of in limbo, which we don't know how it's going to play out. If the U.S. and China get some sort of trade deal, and we will see, which kind of side, the open market side, or the more protectionist that favors certain companies over others will prevail. So watch this space. It's going to be hugely important for the question that we're discussing this morning. And then my fourth question, and that's coming kind of naturally from that last one, is what does China actually want from us? I'm not a China expert. I talk to some of them regularly because we have them at the GMF. But it seems to me that China shares with the Trump administration the idea that this is going to be an era of big power competition. And in that big power competition, the purpose of the Communist Party of China, the primary purpose is to stay in power. So it needs to do two things. It needs to provide prosperity to its people, kind of the old deal that it has always been, kind of doing with its own people for the last about 30 years. And it will have to deliver prestige in the big power competition. Because the Communist Party of China is in permanent warfare with its own people, it needs to deliver prosperity and prestige. So China is in big power mode. And in that big power competition where the Communist Party of China needs to deliver, when it comes to Europe, it has very clear, I think, ambitions. It's either two things. In the positive scenario, it wants to neutralize Europe. It wants to neutralize Europe so that in this big power competition, it doesn't fall on either side, but is somewhere, somehow neutralized, and is not on the American side any longer. In the worst case scenario, it wants to turn us into a tributary part of the world that's connected to the One Belt, One Road initiative, to the Chinese mainland, the two big markets in the Eurasian landmass together, with us as being the tributaries, who for some, Chinese peace and quiet are willing to invest in the market and buy into the market without asking too many questions. That's the negative scenario. I mean, depending on your tastes, you can look at as to where this is going to fall, but I think this is roughly where it's going to go. So China needs to upscale its economy from cheap production to sophisticated. It's massively on the way to do this. It seeks favorable trade terms. Watch Brussels today. It seeks to expand its influence. Watch the 16+1 conference after Brussels. That's going to happen tomorrow. And it seeks to divide us from the US to either neutralize us or turn us into tributaries. So we're not there yet fully, but we're on the way there. And the answer to this is, of course, that all of the stuff that I said before, we have to get economically stronger in our own right, so that that we can be more resilient to the lure of Chinese money that's pouring into our markets, and also stronger so that we can deliver some geopolitical services that then don't have to be supplied by others. If we continue the bickering that we see now, and the willingness to fall to the temptation of Chinese money pouring into our market, again, we will be toast. It was a huge problem that Italy subscribed to the One Belt, One Road initiative a couple of days ago. Perhaps not as dramatic as some of the press reports made it, but it is an ominous sign. So 4 questions. Does America want to keep its real estate in Europe? How can we stay economically stronger? Can we add a power politics element to the EU? What does China actually want? I haven't talked about climate change or big data or urbanization or some of these other big mega trends that people keep on talking about, but all of those things, of course, happen as well while we are asking ourselves the big 4 questions that I mentioned. So certainly not a time to be complacent. Europe will have a space in this new game that's being played, but what kind of space it is depends mostly on us, but not entirely. As I said, it also depends on American decisions and on Chinese decisions. But we have to be strong in all of this in order not to become just the object of these decisions that are being made. Currently, we're not creating a great image of being a subject, a player, but we need to. We need to really turn ourselves into this, which is why some of the Euroscepticism that you see is understandable and is warranted, but is not the final answer to the question that we're asking ourselves, which is, how can we have the life that I sketched out earlier? And I want to say one thing about, and that's the final thing, about this security guarantee issue that I mentioned in the first question. There's a tendency to bilateralize this, and I know that, of course, I'm in Warsaw, and this is a country that seeks a bilateral arrangement with the United States, and it's completely understandable. I understand where it comes from. How do you develop trust in NATO structures? How do you develop trust in allies like Germany or France, for that matter? And if you can't rely on them, then what you seek is go to the hegemon. It's understandable, and I would probably do a very similar thing if I were a decision maker in Warsaw. But at the same time, it is also a dangerous undertaking. First of all, a security guarantee that's based on a monetary contribution is valueless, is not worth the value. America will defend Europe because of a strategic interest, not because of a fee that we're paying. Washington has to decide whether it's still in its interest to defend this market, and not because we're paying $1 billion or 2 or 3 or 10. That's not going to be the decisive factor. It plays a political role, but it's not going to be the decisive factor. And so if you have a security guarantee that's based on bought soldiers, that's going to be a very brittle one. But at the same time, it's, of course, understandable that you seek it, but I think we should not kid ourselves about the value of such a security guarantee. If we cannot make a case to the United States as Europeans together that this is worth defending, then the bought soldiers of America will not save us. They will not be the tripwire that we hope they will be, because mercenaries are less valuable than soldiers that are sent in good faith. And I'm saying this, also to provoke a little bit of a debate, and I'm, blackening and whitening this a little bit, but I think this is what we need to think about. And this is why that first question, does America want to keep its real estate, is so important. If it wants to keep its real estate into a profit center, then that's not going to work. That's not going to be a strategic relationship. And I'm saying this being fully aware of my own country's poor performance in all of this. But I think we should also be aware that Washington's decisions matter greatly, and you cannot monetarize a security guarantee. As soon as you do this, it loses its value. So the bilateralism that this country and also some other countries seek is not going to work. It's not going to work as much as a German equidistance dream is not going to work, and as much as strategic autonomy in Europe is not going to work. If we want an American security guarantee, it needs to be the strategic one from both sides. It cannot be monetized. It's a bit of a European instinct to monetize decisions. It's something that made the EU quite successful. But in foreign policy, these kinds of things cannot be monetized, which is perhaps the most important reason as to why foreign policy cannot be fed into the old integration logic. You cannot buy compromise. Either you're there or you're not. The in-between way is not with the kind of value that you need. I leave it at this. I hope I've tossed enough stuff out there. Most of these arguments are a lot more sophisticated than the ones that I could make in this very short presentation that I have prepared here this morning. And of course, as a think tanker, I have the privilege to be sufficiently imprecise, and also I'm not really responsible for anything that I'm saying afterwards, which is great, but I hope that at least, we can have an interesting debate about these kinds of things. Thanks a lot for your patience with me and my mumblings, and again to Marek and everybody else who made this possible. Thanks a lot.